Okay, folks, well, hello and welcome to this next presentation in the series of webinars on FusionReactor. And this one is on setting up and using the FusionReactor Enterprise Dashboard. And my name is Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this presentation, we'll be talking about using that dashboard. Sorry, I just got distracted for a moment. I just wanted to say, for those who don't know me, I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself. My company is carehart.org, and I spend my days focused on server troubleshooting, and a lot of that time is spent showing people FusionReactor. I don't work for the company, but I'm a big fan of the product and of the company, known them for several years, 10 plus years, been using it all that time, and especially interested in showing you today the dashboard, because I find a lot of people either have it and don't take advantage of it, or have it and don't fully take advantage of it. Some don't even know about it. So we're going to try to address all those audiences. So after a quick overview of some things, I'll start with a quick demo of the dashboard for those who've never seen it before. Maybe take a few minutes to show you some of the key things that you can do with it. And then that'll set the stage for the rest, which will be first understanding what editions do support the dashboard. And it's most editions, but not all, so we'll explain that. And then we'll talk about the choices you have for implementing the dashboard in terms of where you can put it, which might be surprising, how you go about adding things to it, and then the pros and cons of different choices that you may have. And then we'll get near the end, we'll talk about a feature of the dashboard that some folks never take advantage of, don't notice, and that is that you can have it detect and handle unresponsive instances that are being monitored by the dashboard. So if you've got the dashboard watching, say, an instance of ColdFusion, an instance of Lucy, an instance of Tomcat, and it becomes unresponsive in some way that the monitor can detect, then the monitor will not only detect it and show you, but it'll help manage it and help you deal with it. So we'll talk about that when we get there. And then we'll close out with a couple of other notable aspects of the dashboard that, again, you could miss if you weren't looking closely at it. And then we'll have time for questions and answers in the end. And I'll keep an eye on questions throughout, so if you have something, I may not see it as soon as you post it, but I'll try to take breaks every once in a while and see if anybody has posted any. In fact, let me take a look real quick and see if anybody has. Nope. Okay. All right. So first I want to say that we're presuming that you already know what FusionReactor is, you're already using it. This is not an overview of FusionReactor or an introduction to it. So if you're perhaps a new user to it and somehow this one caught your attention or somebody directed you to it because they thought you ought to see this, let me just be clear. The dashboard is just a subset of the functionality. In fact, like I said a moment ago, there are people that use FusionReactor and never use the dashboard, either because they don't have it, because they don't have the edition that has it, or even if they do have it, they don't have a need for it. So we'll explain what it is and what it's useful for, because there's definitely value. But I just want to say there's much, much more to FusionReactor than just this dashboard. So also you may or may not be on the latest version, which is FusionReactor 6, and the dashboard is basically the same in 6 as it was in 5. I'm not aware of there being any significant changes, maybe a couple, but not in terms of what I'll be showing you today. And then, as I said, you may not even be using the dashboard yet, which I abbreviate ED for Enterprise Dashboard, or just not fully leveraging it. And I'm willing to bet that there's people who say they use it regularly who will still learn new things. I'll look forward in the end to hearing if anybody says, nope, didn't learn a thing. So anyway, as always, I made this comment a moment ago. I want to repeat it and make it really clear. FusionReactor, all these features I'm going to talk about, apply to any Java or CFML server that FusionReactor can monitor. So you may be a Java person, don't know what ColdFusion or CFML is, that's fine. Or you may be a ColdFusion person who never touches Java, that's fine too. The product works the same regardless, so it serves all those audiences, any CFML server, any Java application server, Tomcat, Wildfly, JBoss, Jetty, Glassfish, whatever. So. And then finally, with regard to this talk, I'm going to say that I'll use the phrase machine and server interchangeably when I'm talking about where you might put this FusionReactor dashboard, or where an instance might be that the dashboard's paying attention to. And when I use those, again, they're interchangeable, and I mean whether they're real or virtual. It just makes no difference to the product or to the licensing or anything. So whatever makes sense for you, you hear it the way it means for you. And then I'll just throw out that there are some topics I'll go over. Well, I'll just talk about them in passing, and they'll have been presented in more detail in other webinars. So we've had troubleshooting webinars, post-mortem troubleshooting webinars, hidden gems webinars. So you can go to the webinars page, just Google FusionReactor webinars, and you'll be taken right to it, and you can see all these previous webinars and the recordings to hear some more detail about some things I might skip over. And this, like this, that one, like those, this one is being recorded, and you'll be able to revisit the things that I share here. Alrighty, so let's start with a quick demo. Let me get up on the screen my server that's running my FusionReactor Dashboard. Okay, so let me just say, for those who've never seen the dashboard or paid attention to it, how would you even get to it? So the first thing is, notice, just a second, notice that, sorry, I'm having some difficulty with multiple monitor support. I'm not seeing my mouse on the screen. There you go. So the dashboard is this globe up here at the top. Now, some of you may be looking at this and saying, hey, where are all the buttons on the left? I'm going to discuss later how you can use the dashboard either in a FRAM instance, that's what this is, a FRAM instance, or in your own FusionReactor instance. So if you're looking at your FusionReactor right now and you see all these buttons on the left, look up at the top of the screen. If you have the globe icon there, then you could put your dashboard inside that globe icon. If you don't have the globe icon, it means you have FusionReactor Standard, and I'll talk a bit later about how Standard doesn't have the dashboard. But anyway, if you see it, you've got the dashboard, and if you click on it, you'll see a drop-down menu of things that you can do. You can see the dashboard, manage servers in the dashboard, manage groups in the dashboard, and manage settings. And we're going to talk about all these things today. But for now, let's not get too hung up on those details. I just want to talk about what is the purpose of the dashboard. So it's primarily when you have multiple instances or multiple application servers that you want to monitor with FusionReactor. You've got them set up so that they have FusionReactor in them, and maybe you're used to just going from one browser tab to another browser tab to look at them all, and that works, and that's okay, and there's value to that. But maybe you'd like to have one screen on which you can see them all, and that's what the dashboard's about. So here you can see some different instances that I have, and you can see different colors. And let me just tell you before I go into too much detail, the colors are an indication of how the instance is doing. So here's an instance called demo, and the blue means it's doing well. Here's an instance that, don't worry about the details of what it's called, but the point is it's red, that's bad, and it says specifically con, C-O-N-N. Well, that's saying that this instance can't be connected to. It's unavailable right now. Now that could either mean it's momentarily unavailable, which would be a problem, and this would be telling us, oh, you've got a problem, server's not available. Or this could be a permanent situation where, yeah, that's no longer really even being used. It's an old instance we used to have, and we no longer use it. And in fact, this one is of that sort, and you'll see that it's gray. Well, if you have an instance that's in the dashboard and it turns red, and you know there's a reason for it being red, like it's down for days or it's no longer being used. But if you have some reason you want to leave it in the dashboard, there's a little minus sign up in the top right corner, and you click on that little minus sign and it goes from being red to being gray. So that's how you can disable an instance, so it's no longer being red for a reason that you understand. Now, if it's red temporarily, you want to deal with it. You don't want to disable it, but I'm just saying you could disable it. So let's take a look at an instance that is set up. If I click on this link, just anywhere, just click anywhere on this, notice that I see a little more detail about that instance. So at first I didn't see the details, I just saw the instances, and if I click on an instance I can see the details, and we'll talk a little bit later about what all these things are. But you might be noticing these boxes over here and wondering what are those about. Well, notice the icon's different. It's a group of instances, a group. Now you can put instances into a group, and when you have a group and you click on a group, then you see under that the instances that are in that group. And I just happen to have only one instance in that group, so don't worry about that. You could have 1, 2, 5, 10, 100. They would all show up. So a group is a group of instances, and the color reflects the overall health of all the instances. If one of them were red, then the box would turn red. This would turn red. And this one happens to be healthy, and it's doing okay. Now look up in the top right corner, just while we're talking, this one turned yellow. Only momentarily, and it turned yellow and said long, and that was telling us, okay, it had a long-running request and it was temporarily taking long enough to have warned us, but it went away. And I wouldn't respond to every change of color that you see. But anyway, back to the grouping. So if I click on a particular instance within a group, I'll see the details for that instance, but I just want you to see that if I had more than one instance in this group, this first level display would be about all the instances in the group. It says group size only 1, but if I had more than one, this would be a summary overview of key metrics about all the instances in the group. And if I click on an instance, then again, I see the details of that instance. Now, let's just talk about this. This is similar to what you see in the FusionReactor interface itself. Those who usually sit in FusionReactor and, for instance, look at the metrics, web metrics, this is pretty much what you see, these same graphs. They're just aligned differently in that interface. And this detail, server uptime, which is the instance uptime, you know, how long has your application server been up? When did it start? That sort of thing. How many requests have there been? How long have they taken on average? What's the memory like? CPU like? These are just high-level key metrics that are also on the instance itself. Now, I'm just saying that the point of the dashboard is to be able to see all this in one quick observational view, looking at the colors. You might not even drill into anything. You just sit there and go, okay, it's looking good. But let's say you did have an instance that you wanted to understand better and you wanted to drill into it. Well, all these links in blue, these words in blue, they're links. That's a link, that's a link. These little arrows at the bottom right corner of each box, those are links. And they would take you to the FusionReactor instance itself. So if I wanted to look at this is my careheart.org instance, I could either click this button or click this button or any one of these buttons, and they would go to a particular page, or if I click these two buttons, they just go to whatever is set in FusionReactor as the home page, which for me is my metrics, web metrics. So I'm going to click on that link, and a new tab is going to open in my browser, and it's going to automatically take it to it and automatically log me in, because we'll talk about when you add elements to the dashboard, service to the dashboard, you provide the password. So when you click a link from the dashboard, you go right into that instance and you're looking at the details of that instance. And I'm having some network problems and speed issues, so for the moment, don't worry about how slow that is for me. For you, it'd probably come up instantly. But here's my FusionReactor instance. Again, in the full instance, for those that are familiar with it, there's all the buttons on the left that you would expect. Okay, now I've said that there is a dashboard in every instance of FusionReactor, as long as it's not the standard edition. You've got a dashboard there. Now this globe icon, if I click on it, there's going to be nothing in it, because this is my FusionReactor instance itself, and while I could put a dashboard in it, I didn't. Now this could have confused some of you if you kind of turned away for a moment. Let me make this really clear. If you look at the address bar in my browser, we're looking at this 8089 port for this, which is my main FusionReactor instance that's watching, in my case, my sites, in my case, Cold Fusion instance. That's 8089. If I go back a tab to the dashboard, we'll notice that's in the 8087. That's called the FRAM instance, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But the point is, I have chosen to put my dashboard in my FRAM instance to look at my CF instance for careheart.org and any other servers I want to watch. But I could have put it in any particular instance, and we'll talk about why you might want to choose one way or the other. Some of you can already imagine why you'd want to choose one way or another. But the point is, you can see this level of detail, drill down into it. One last thing before we move on is I just want to explain in the dashboard some of these things that you see, this MCRD. That's for memory, CPU, request, and database activity. And so as I'm sitting here, you'll notice my memory goes from being green to being yellow. So it's fluctuating, and I believe, yeah, here we can see the percentage of memory right there. It's 47%. We're talking about the heap. In the case of FusionReactor's focus on memory on these main pages, the focus is on the heap. Some of you may know, and we've talked in other webinars about how you can look at other aspects of the JVM memory, the metaspace, the permgen, code cache, things like that. But the point is that these things focus for the most part on the heap. And so here we can see the heap within that instance, and it's hovering at about half of the total heap available, and there's a graph to reflect it, a little speedometer graph to reflect it, even text to reflect it. And when it gets above 50, there you just see it's about to turn yellow from green as it goes up and down. It just does go up and down. The JVM heap goes up and down all the time. But if that were to rise to a certain level, it would turn yellow. If it rose to another level, it would turn red. Same with request activity and database activity and CPU. So these are just, again, high-level ways you can sit here watching. You can see how if I was just on a list of all the servers, I could just see the pipes and see are they a concern. Watch the box. If it turns yellow, I could look and see, was it any of these that are also being high? So it's a real quick visual way to get a sense of how your server's doing. And then drill in to see some levels of detail. And then if you want to, drill down into even further levels of detail. All right, with that, let me go ahead and take a quick look and see if there's any questions or comments from anybody. Nope. Okay. So let's move on in the presentation. So this is just a reminder for you when you watch this later, what are the sort of things that we talked about, watching the overall health of one or more instances on one or more machines. And I didn't clarify that there, but where those instances are just does not matter. As long as they're accessible to that dashboard as a URL, they could be added to the dashboard. And we saw so it's a subset of key metrics, and you can drill down to more detail, and you can group them, and you can disable them. Okay. And then here's those pipes and those warning lights, they call them in the docs, those status messages like that one that said con, or when it was long running, it said long, and so on, and the colors of the boxes. Now, I didn't focus on this, but let me tell you now, there's some of you, I'm sure, astute observers, and nobody asked, I was surprised. You will see that there's sorry again, I'm having some troubles with the multiple monitor support. There you go. So what I was trying to say is that there are numbers in the top right corner of some of these boxes. Like here, there's a 1. Sorry. And here there's a 2. And they're up here, 1 and 2, and up here, 1. You may wonder what those are about. Well, in fact, just to make sure, because this is not really limited to the dashboard, if I come over here to my real FusionReactor instance, and real is not, it's just the full FusionReactor instance, it's monitoring given instance of whatever app server you have. There's numbers up there as well. So these are called notifications. So they're not unique to the dashboard. And you may have never paid attention to them before. I talked about them in one of the webinars in the past. So the notifications are just information about this instance. And in my case, there's 2 things that it's going to warn me. I'll show you just so you can see what they look like. It's saying that my disk is nearly full. It's at 90%. Isn't that nice of FusionReactor to tell you that? And then it also is telling me that I have not configured my email settings. And I just wanted you to see that this is great stuff. If you don't remember to do something like configure FusionReactor's email so you get notifications of in email of things, we'll talk about some later, this is warning you, hey, you haven't done it. Here's how to do it. Now, if we go back to the dashboard, that's what those numbers were about. They were telling us that we had notifications. And this doesn't provide for you to see those notifications, but it does let you drill in and see the instance that has the notifications, and you can look into things then. Okay. And for information on all this stuff, these high-level, how do things work? If you saw something, you see something on your machine that I didn't talk about, or you've got a value for one of the warning lights that I didn't discuss, it's all documented in the documentation. There's a whole section on the enterprise dashboard in the docs, and furthermore on that page, there's a discussion of the server icons. So I've just given you the full URL to go to it. And again, I know you guys don't get the presentation. You can't click a link here. I would just say that if you were to Google FusionReactor Enterprise Dashboard icons, it would take you to this page. But you'll be able to come back and watch the recording, and if you need to, grab that full URL. Okay, so I've talked about the additions in brief. Let's talk about it in detail. So the Enterprise Dashboard is offered in all editions of FusionReactor except FusionReactor Standard. Now what that means is FusionReactor Enterprise and Ultimate, and also the Trial Edition and the Developer Edition. The developer edition is a relatively new thing. We'll talk about that in a moment, give you more information on that. But the point is, the dashboard is in all of these things. And the dashboard can monitor any kind of FusionReactor instance except a standard instance. So it can monitor all four of the above. So what we're saying is, to see the dashboard, you need Enterprise or Ultimate or Trial or Developer. And then in that dashboard, you can point to any instance of FusionReactor as long as it's not standard. So just to be clear, the bottom line is that one of the things that distinguishes all the additions from standard is standard doesn't include the dashboard. And there's still other things that are added over standard. That's beyond the scope of this talk to talk about. But just be aware that when you use any of these other foreign sorts of licenses, you're getting more than what's in standard. And if you just get standard, you don't get the dashboard. Now, for more about that developer edition that I mentioned, that's relatively new. Here's a link about that. And again, if you were to just Google FusionReactor Developer Edition, you'd find this post. And it's just a piece of news with the details about it, how much it costs, what you can use it for. And it is meant for development. So by the way, when I say that it's got the dashboard in it, you're not supposed to be using that dashboard to look at your production servers. It's a developer edition. Okay, so now let's talk about your choices for implementing the dashboard, where it could be set up. So again, it appears wherever an edition supports it, and you click that globe logo in the top right corner, top left corner, sorry. And I've mentioned that it's also available in this FRAM instance. So let's talk about what FRAM is. When you first install FusionReactor, well, let me back up. There's two ways to install FusionReactor. You can go to the website and get what's called the automatic installer, which I think most people do. Or you can go do what's just called a manual jar install. So let's talk about the automatic installer. When you run the automatic installer, what you get first, whether you're on Windows or Linux, what you get first is something called the FusionReactor Administrative Manager, FRAM. And it's an instance of its own. It runs as a service of its own on Windows or Linux. And it's got its own port. We saw on mine it was port 8087. That's the default. And that instance, as you saw, only had 2 buttons on the left. There's 3 buttons. It's not much. And the purpose of the FRAM is to manage FusionReactor on that machine. Okay? So you'd primarily, after you installed FusionReactor with the automatic installer, and you get that FRAM installed, then the next step is you would add instances. You would add FusionReactor to the various things you have on the server. So in the FRAM, there's something called the Instance Manager. We've talked about this in other webinars. And in there, you put FusionReactor into some given instance that you want to monitor. So the point is, FRAM is just this overall management tool for finding things you want to implement FusionReactor into and putting it into those instances. It happens to have the dashboard. So you could put your FusionReactor dashboard in the FRAM instance. Okay, so that's one thing. And why would you do that? Well, I said you could put the dashboard in a regular instance, and I'm sure some of you have already thought this through. If I put the dashboard, let's say in my ColdFusion instance running my carehart.org site, and that site goes down, it's going to take the dashboard with it. So benefit of having FRAM, having the dashboard in FRAM is that, again, the FRAM instance is its own thing. It's a separate service, and it's not going to go up and down with ColdFusion or Tomcat or JBoss or whatever. Okay, so there's value in putting the dashboard in your FRAM instance to be a watcher of your other instances. Now, actually, let me back up and say, somebody might argue, well, what if the box goes down? I believe I have a point about that in just a moment, but I'll come back to it if I don't. So be aware that the dashboard can watch any FusionReactor instance that it can reach and authenticate to. So we'll see in a moment that when you add an instance to the dashboard, you provide the password. And so then, and you provide the URL to get to that dashboard. So as long as an enterprise dashboard location can reach a FusionReactor instance by a URL, it can be added to the dashboard. So you could be watching from the dashboard instances that are on the same machine or on another machine or other machines. Okay, so you can make your dashboard be as complex as you need it to be. And then I said, what if the box on which you have FRAM is and an instance installed What if the box went down? Well, this is where you might want to implement the dashboard on a machine that doesn't necessarily have any FusionReactor instances. You just install FusionReactor just to get the FRAM, and in that FRAM, you use the dashboard. Now, as things stand right now, you would need to have a separate license because the FusionReactor is licensed per box. So you'd have FusionReactor on one box where you've actually got it monitoring particular instances of things on that box. And I'm saying if you wanted to also put FusionReactor on some other box just for the purpose of having a FRAM on that box, just for the purpose of having a dashboard in that FRAM, you could, but that would require a separate license of FusionReactor. And that's being discussed as to whether there might be a better way to go with that. You might want to contact the sales folks at the end if you want to make a case for something about that. But the point is you could. I want you to see that you've got great flexibility to do whatever makes sense for you. So you could just run the dashboard within the one instance you have if there's some benefit to doing that. You could run it in the FRAM of the machine on which you've got FusionReactor running, or you can put it in another machine. In fact, let me just tell you. So you can, as a summary, you can put it in the UI of your FusionReactor instance wherever you've got it installed, and it can watch itself and watch others. And the limitation of watching itself is, of course, if it goes down, it won't be able to tell you that it went down. It'll just go down. You could put it in a FRAM instance on the same machine that has other FusionReactor instances, and that could watch those instances or any other instances on any other machine. And then finally, as I said, you could put it on a machine that has no FusionReactor instances, but you could put it in the FRAM there, and it could watch any FusionReactor instance. Okay? Hope that makes sense. Let me look over and see if there's been any questions, because I could imagine that could have led to some. Nope. So far, so good. Thank you all. Okay. And again, all this applies to the FusionReactor editions other than Standard. Standard doesn't have the dashboard at all and cannot be monitored by the dashboard. All right, let's talk about adding instances to the dashboard. So one way, and I don't want to demonstrate this because I'd have to reinstall FusionReactor, but notice that when you, or let me be clear, there's this automatic option. Not so much when you install FusionReactor, but for those who've installed it, you know that once you install it and you've got the FRAM instance installed, you can use the feature in the FRAM instance manager to add FusionReactor into a given instance. Well, when you add FusionReactor into a given instance, the wizard that pops up and walks you through the process, one of the questions is, do you want to put that instance in this FRAM's dashboard? So the FRAM from which you're doing the add of the instance could have a dashboard, and the instance manager says, do you want me to add this instance to my dashboard? And then you'd end up with your FRAM having a dashboard with your instances. And it does it, I believe, by default. So some of you maybe haven't even noticed this. If you go back and look at your 8087 port to look at your FRAM, you may see that your dashboard's already got whatever instances you've got on the machine. Now, let me say before I go on to the manual approach, I said earlier that when one does a download of FusionReactor, there's two choices. One is an automated installer. The other is just a jar approach. If one does that jar approach, then they just get a jar, and then they get instructions for how to put that jar in the right place, make a modification to the JVM configuration of the instance they want to monitor, and then boom, FusionReactor is running. When you do that, there is no FRAM thing. There's no FRAM service, there's no FRAM instance, and then there's no instance manager. So this won't make sense to those who do a purely manual install. But for those who do the regular automated installer, which is most people, I'm saying you've got this option that when you add a new instance, you're automatically offered the opportunity to put that instance into the dashboard, and it does it by default, and in the dashboard of the FRAM instance from which you're running the instance manager. But you could also, anybody who has FusionReactor and sees a dashboard could add instances into that dashboard using the manual approach of clicking on the Manage Servers icon. So let me take you to that, show you what that's about. Okay. So up here, oops. Up here at the top where the globe icon appears, I said there was a link to the dashboard, and I'd mentioned in passing earlier that there was this Manage Servers option. So if we click on that, that provides an interface where we can point to servers And then down at the bottom, it shows you what servers are already in that dashboard. So you might remember I'd had a few in there, and here's what they were known by their name that appeared on the screen. Here's the URL for getting to that particular dashboard. And I could edit any of them by clicking them, and it would fill in the screen with what those values were. Or the point, again, for this part of the discussion is if you want to point to a new server, you can point to it by giving it a name, providing the URL. Now, FusionReactor starts out with this sample URL, and pay close attention to this. I mean, I realize this is going to probably be different. You might have a different IP address, machine name, URL, might be a different port, but the point is you want to do this. You don't want to just go to the FusionReactor interface and grab this and maybe take out that and say, I'm just going to copy that and put it in there. That's not what it wants. Notice what it wants is not that file name. It just wants that portion. So if I was going to copy it from a browser, get just that portion, pay attention to how it gives you this example that says what I want, and put that in there. So if I were going to do it, that's how I would do it. Okay, and then I'd give it a name, and I'd give it the password that I need to get into FusionReactor. Now, I've talked in the Hidden Gems talk about how there's a capability of multiple types of users. There's an administrator user, a manager, and an observer. And they have 3 different passwords. They're not all enabled by default. Usually only the administrator password's enabled. Well, if you want to change that, look in the top left corner of the FusionReactor menu and choose Change Password, and you'll see these other 2 types of observer and manager. Again, that's getting beyond the scope of this talk. But my point is you need the password for the administrator for FusionReactor, which is the one that you probably always use. If you don't do anything about those other users, you're using the administrator password, and the point is put in your administrator password. Now, if you forget some of what I've talked about, or you don't pay attention to this URL and you paste it in and it doesn't work, notice that as with all of FusionReactor's interface, there's this eye icon. Many people miss this, but if you click it, it says, what is the URL for the instance? It should look like this. And then the password says it needs to be the administrator password. So if you're having trouble, click these buttons. You might be reminded of something that I've said, or in the future on your own, you learned something. Okay? So that's how you would add something if you wanted to add it to a group, and if you defined a group, the groups would appear here. If you haven't defined any groups, it won't appear. I know I haven't talked yet about scripting. We'll talk about that later. And the monitor, that's just of whether you want to have it be enabled or not. Remember that little minus sign? So if you'll notice down here under monitoring, no, 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 yes, yes, these are 3 where I clicked the little minus sign, and that changed this value of yes to no. So in this interface, it's about this drop down of monitor or not monitor. In the dashboard itself, it's that little minus sign in the top right corner. And of course, you can delete them as well. And then you can test them. Now, if you put in a URL and a password and you hit submit and it comes up with an error here, it may tell you, hey, I couldn't reach that server, or you didn't give me a valid password. It'll tell you in a pop-up message and also on the screen. But you can also just come in here and click this test button. And here you can see that one's okay. Now I'll go to one where I know it's not working and click test. And it says invalid URL, no data retrieved. And so what it is that instance is not running. I know that it's not running, but it's saying, hey, there's something about that that's not working. It can't discern that because it couldn't get a response. All I can say is, as far as I know, it's an invalid URL. All right, and just to remind you, if you click on edit, it just populates the screen up here with those values of that particular one, and I could change it and save it. All right, so that's that. Let's see if there's any questions. Nope. So again, you need to know the instance's URL and port, if any, and then the FusionReactor administrative password. To be able to add something to the dashboard, you need to know those 3 things. And as a reminder, that URL and its port needs to be accessible from the machine on which you're running the enterprise dashboard. I just throw this out because sometimes people get a little confused about things and they're just not stopping to think. So the FRAM, the enterprise dashboard is running in some FusionReactor, either in an instance or in a FRAM, and it's on some machine. And the instance you want to point to might be on some other machine. Well, the FRAM on machine A needs to be able to reach the URL for the FusionReactor on machine B. and if it can't reach it, then it won't be able to put it in the monitor. You might have to open a port to the firewall or something like that to make the enterprise dashboard machine have access. Just think those things through. And there's docs. We'll talk about that stuff later. In fact, sorry. Yes, there's docs right there. Yes, I did write these slides, and I think ahead before I even write, before I even say something. I knew I'd be thinking of this. So, you know, there's much more documentation about the managed servers feature, and I've given links everywhere in this presentation to what those are. And let me say at the end, that by the end, if you think there's a lot of links there, you'd like to just get them, I'm sure we can arrange to send you the presentation as a PDF, and it'll have links in it, and you can just click them that way. So I'll give you the email address for the sales. It's sales@fusion-reactor.com. I'll say that at the end, and you could certainly send a request to them and say, I'd like to have the presentation so I can get those links. Now finally, in terms of adding instances to the dashboard, there's an option that many of you maybe never even knew was there. So we've got the automatic way during the FRAM Instance Manager feature. We've got the manual way by using the Managed Servers option. And then there's an option to do it via JVM ARGs. Yes, there is. So there's some FusionReactor specific, enterprise dashboard specific JVM ARGs that will register a given instance, whatever JVM you're launching. It'll register that instance with some other dashboard. So think of it as you're pushing to some other dashboard your request for it to watch you. Now this is especially valuable when you're scripting implementation of an instance, such as on something like Amazon Web Services. Okay, so if you think about it, you want the instance to spin up, and you need it to do all it needs to do without any interaction. Well, how would you get it to be listed in a dashboard on some other machine? You'd have to go to that other machine and add it. And you could, but the point is there are these JVM ARGs where you can say in the JVM of the instance that you're spinning up, hey, put me into that other server's dashboard and watch me from that other dashboard. And if you think about it, there's nothing wrong with this. You've got to be able to edit the JVM configuration for the instance. You're going to point to the dashboard where you want to be. You're going to provide the information that's needed to authenticate into that enterprise dashboard. You have to log in to FusionReactor, either the FRAM or the regular FusionReactor, to see the dashboard. So you'll provide all the authentication information that you need to make that connection. Okay. And this is documented in its own section called using FusionReactor in AWS. And it's not limited to using with AWS. You could use it for other purposes. But just again, Google using FusionReactor in AWS, and you'll find this page with the docs and the 3 or 4 JVM ARGs that are in there. Okay. All right, now before I move on to this next major section, let me just hop over. Okay, still no questions, good. All righty, so that's, you know, if you just knew what I've gone through now, you'd make great use of the dashboard, and some people do use the dashboard and that's it. They know those things or most of those things, and they don't ever do what I'm about to talk about. But there is a capability for the dashboard to detect and handle an unresponsive instance. Yeah. So let's talk about that. So FusionReactor, the dashboard, that page that we were looking at that had those different servers, by them being in that dashboard and the underlying, you know, software that supports it is constantly reaching out to the instances that are listed there, saying, how you doing? How you doing? How you doing? You still okay? How you doing? Tell me how you're doing now. Now, don't worry, it's not crazy, you know, like every second or anything like that. But there are settings that say, it's called a heartbeat check. And there's settings that say how often should it check, and after how many failures, or after how long would it be considered that it's not being responsive, how many seconds, and after how many seconds, sorry, after how many failures repeatedly should it deem it to be really unresponsive. So the point is you can manage that to be whatever you want it to be. The default choices are good for almost everybody. But the point is it is constantly reaching out saying, hey, FusionReactor instance, how you doing? Can you tell me? Because remember, the dashboard shows the metrics from within the instance that it's talking to. So it sends out a request to that to that instance and says, you know, tell me how many requests are running. Tell me how the CPU is doing. How's the memory doing? All those things that it says it wants to get, it's pulling those back into the dashboard. Well, if it can't get that information from that instance, it's going to deem, hey, that instance isn't responding. And after a few attempts, after a long enough time, it's going to show you that in the interface. So if the dashboard will detect when some monitored FusionReactor instance isn't responding, and we saw that it, it changed colors, it would turn red and it would say con, saying I can't connect. So it visually indicates it in the dashboard, and you can optionally configure email in the dashboard to send you a notification by email. And you can script a response or reaction. I didn't want to say script a response to an unresponsive server, that gets clumsy, but you could react to an unresponsive server, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But as far as configuring the email is concerned, let me just tell you that what we're talking about is in the enterprise dashboard, or in the instance that has the FusionReactor dashboard, enterprise dashboard. So like this one here, sorry. This one here. This is where my dashboard lives. There's my dashboard. I'm saying that wherever your dashboard lives, in the top left corner of that FusionReactor, there's a FusionReactor menu. And in that menu, the first option is settings. And in those settings, you configure who does the email come from, who does it go to, what mail server should it use, and any needed username and password for the mail server, and so on. And again, there's help for all these things. And I cover this stuff in a previous webinar called Configuring FusionReactor for Action. So you can go back on that in more detail. But again, the key is you look in FusionReactor settings, and you want to do that in the case of getting the notifications about the dashboard, you want to do that in whatever instance has the dashboard. So for instance, if I come over here to my FusionReactor instance that's monitoring my Carrot.org site, you might remember we saw a notification that said I did not have my email configured. And I don't, and I need to fix that. For me to get crash protection notifications or my daily reports, other things we talked about in previous webinars, I need this configured. And I just recently installed this, so I just had not done it. But my point is, notice that's empty, whereas on this page, it was not empty, because they're two different things. This is my 8089 in this case, watching a particular instance, and this is my 8087, it's my FRAM, which has my dashboard. I'm saying the FusionReactor settings for this will control whether you get a notification from the dashboard saying, hey, an instance has become unavailable. Okay? So those emails will come when this instance is deemed to not be, some instances deemed not to be responsive. You'll get an email saying, seems to be down. And then when it comes back up, either because it just resolves or you restart the instance or somebody restarts the instance, you'll get another email saying, okay, it's back up. So that's the notifications in the email, and that's nice. Now, let me just say real quickly, if you've experienced that those email notifications, you only get a notification saying that the instance is up, and you never get a notification that the instance is down. If we were in a class, I'd ask, does anybody know why that happens? Because there's a reason why that happens. That's what happens if you set up your dashboard in an instance itself. If I put this FusionReactor inside of its own dashboard, well, think about it. If the instance goes down, the dashboard goes with it, and it can't send a notification to say the instance has gone down. But as soon as the instance comes back up, the dashboard comes back up inside of the instance, and it detects that the instance it was watching is now back up and available. And so it is able to tell you that it's back up. It's just not able to tell you that it goes down. So this is one more reason why you really want to consider putting the dashboard somewhere other than an instance itself. So you can, but you ought to put it somewhere else. And the FRAM instance is a great place to put it, or a FRAM on another box is a great place to put it. Okay. Let me check for questions. Nope, still no questions. Actually, could one of you, just somebody send a question, say, hey, I'm here, I hear you. Just want to make sure, because I've never gone this long without any questions, which is probably a good thing. But I just want to make sure. Yep, there you go. Thank you. Nobody needs to do any more. I see a few already. Thank you all very much. Great webinar. Thank you. So that's a good sign, right, that there's no questions, because I'm answering your questions before you even ask them. Okay. So we'll get back to scripting responses in a moment. Now, one thing I want to make notice of about this unresponsive instance detection is that it's not about the dashboard calling some URL in your application, okay? So it's not sending a request to your application calling your home page, and it's not detecting that your database is unresponsive, or that some HTTP call you make out of your application isn't responding, or anything like that. It's just about the dashboard calling the FusionReactor instance and saying, can you tell me what's going on in that instance? Give me the metrics. Tell me how it's doing. Okay, so some of you may know that there can be times when your application is not responsive, but FusionReactor is. That's a benefit of FusionReactor, is that it's looking at things from the JVM perspective. The FusionReactor interface may come up. You may look at it and you may say, this is interesting. I have many requests running right now and they're taking a very long time because they're running long queries. Well, in some application servers, once more than so many are running, maybe a 20 or 50, there's a setting that says once this many are running, don't let in any more. Well, in that case, you will seem to think users will be complaining that they can't run requests. But you can go to FusionReactor and go, no, the instance is up and running. My app is not responding, but FusionReactor is still running. And I can see, oh, the app's not responding because there's long-running queries or whatever. But my point is, in that case, FusionReactor is still up. And the dashboard's going to think that FusionReactor is still up. So get it? The dashboard is not really watching your application. Some of you know that there's tools out there to do that. If you want a tool that runs a particular page in your application, you have to get some other tool that's all it does. It sends a request to your application. And I appreciate that you might think, well, goodness, that's what I wanted this to do. Well, it doesn't, because this is very specific. Remember, the dashboard is talking to the FusionReactor instance in your environment. It's within your JVM, and it's saying, hey, how are things going in there? Tell me how many requests are running. Tell me how the CPU and memory are. So it's got to be able to talk to it, get the response. And those things can be responding even though your application within the instance is not, for whatever reason. So we've talked about troubleshooting webinars, post-mortem troubleshooting webinars. So those discussions are elsewhere. The point is, the dashboard's just saying, hey, FusionReactor instance, can you respond to me? And if it can't, then the dashboard deems it to be unresponsive. Important distinction that I think people need to hear. Now, it is true that sometimes your application problems will eventually lead to overall unavailability of the instance. Like you might run out of heap or run out of metaspace, or you might have some process that's using up all the CPU in the JVM. So there are circumstances where you've probably noticed that things are so bad you can't get into FusionReactor in the instance in question. Well, that would be an example of when the dashboard would say, hey, I'm not hearing anything back from my FusionReactor instance over there. He seems to be unresponsive. That's what it would detect. So granted, it's a subset of what you might consider to be when you'd like to be notified. But it's an important subset, and it's what it does do and what it can do. And that's what it'll do. And if you need to do something else, I'm afraid you have to get some other tool to do that other thing. So let's talk about configuring the notification and detection of an unresponsive server. So I'm sorry, I realized that when I talked about this earlier, I forgot that I had the slide here that I covered it. So you can configure it to send the email notification. It'll send you that up and down. And you only get the up if you're watching the instance itself. And there's where the configuration is done in the dashboard. And there's more on that in the documentation about settings. So again, that's the settings for FusionReactor. All the FusionReactor instances you have a FusionReactor menu in the top left corner. They all have a settings button. So this is not enterprise dashboard settings. This is just generic FusionReactor settings. Every instance has that settings. Now, I wanted to clarify this point of when does an instance get deemed unresponsive? That's configurable too. How many seconds should it not get a response? And how many failed such heartbeat checks should there be before it's deemed unresponsive? That's configurable. That's in enterprise settings. So let me just take a look at that really quick. Go back to the FusionReactor dashboard. So here in the dashboard, I've shown you already there's the dashboard and the managed servers. We'll go back to groups in a bit, but then there's settings. So this settings is not FusionReactor settings. This is dashboard, enterprise dashboard settings. In that settings, First, you can configure whether you do get these yes or no, and they're enabled by default, so you don't need to tweak it generally. But then here, the heartbeat settings for monitor instances. So how often should it check? It checks every 5 seconds. After how many seconds of no response would it be deemed to be unresponsive? After 25 seconds of no response, it would be deemed unresponsive. And then how many of those in a row have to occur before it'll get flagged in the interface and in an email and then the scripting that we'll talk about in a moment. So basically you can see that an instance would need, by default, it would need to be down for 75 seconds, 3 times 25 in a row. If it doesn't get a response after 75 seconds, then it turns red, you get an email, and a scripted response could happen. Now, before you go, oh, that's a long time, 75 seconds, I don't know about that. Well, just be careful, because if you lower this number, you may start getting emails when it's not really down. It's just a momentary network burp that kept this dashboard from reaching that server. So you just have to always be cautious when you tweak these things. You know, just find the right balance between notification soon enough and notification too soon. All right, but that's that. Simple as that. And again, there's documentation on that enterprise settings. And there's more in there. We'll cover a couple things in a moment. But let's talk about scripting a response first. So we're talking about detecting that an instance is unresponsive. We've seen now how it looks. We've seen what you can do to handle it. And now, most importantly for some of you, is you might like this idea of being able to script a reaction to the fact that an instance is unresponsive. If it makes sense, yes, you can script the dashboard to react to that unresponsive instance. You might want to trigger restart of the instance, or maybe something a little more refined than that, because again, it might just be a network incompatible, problem, and the instance may be fine. So you might want to think twice about just restarting it simply because this didn't get a response. But the point is, with the scripting capability, you could run any command, any bat file, any exe in Windows, or any command or shell script or binary in Linux. Yeah, you can do whatever you want. It's specified when you add the instance. Remember when we were in the dashboard and going to the manage servers, there was an option to provide a script. So if you pointed to a script, and here's help about it, and there's documentation for it, because it's definitely a little bit more advanced topic, you could point to a script on the server where the dashboard lives, and that script will run when you tell it, when it detects that a given instance is unresponsive. And so obviously you could have different scripts for different instances. Pretty cool stuff. Now, I just said that the script runs on the machine from which the dashboard lives. Some of you might be thinking, oh, wait a second, what if the dashboard is on server A and the instance being watched is on server B? How can we tell server B to restart a given instance? Well, you can. You can cause an action on a remote server in Linux and even in Windows. In the case of Windows, there's a free tool, some of you may have heard of it from the sysinternals group of Microsoft, and it's called PSExec. And with that tool, you can point to a remote server and issue command line commands on a remote server. And in Linux, that's a built-in capability. So I'll just say that if you want to learn more about that, read about that on your own, you can just Google PSExec and you'll pretty much come up with this as the link right away. And as far as more on the monitoring scripts, honestly, there's not much more to say for me. There's some subtleties and details that you might want to read about if you're going to get into it, and there's a whole discussion. In fact, there's two. There's basically a manual called Using Enterprise Scripting. It stands on its own. Honestly, it's not much more than the equivalent of a couple pages in the other doc, so look at both of them. These are two different things. And that happens over time in the docs. Different people write different things, and sometimes there's similar stuff in different places, and that's being rectified and reconciled over time. But for now, just be aware that if you're interested in scripting, there's these two places to go look at. And let me just hop over real quick and see if there's any questions. Yeah, yes. What's the effect of having a dashboard in FRAM as well as the instance? So what's the effect of having a dashboard in FRAM as well as the instance? Okay, that's an interesting question. Let me talk about that. So I think what you're saying is you might have a dashboard in a FRAM instance, and you might have a dashboard within a given FusionReactor instance. So basically your point is some instance is listed in the dashboard in two different dashboards. That's the bottom line, right? And what would be the impact? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Let me be clear. And you may not notice there to be any negative impact at all, because the dashboard sending its request to the instance to just get those bit of metrics, it's really lightweight. If you were to study it closely, and there is documentation, and also you can just watch stuff with network protocol things, you'd see it's just basically a REST call to the server to get back a JSON packet that it then uses to populate the graph. So it's nothing heavyweight. And the FusionReactor instance that's being talked to is already gathering all that information to display in its own UI, or to fire alerts or tracking its logs or whatever. So you're not asking the instance to do any new work. It's just basically, you might think of it as the network communication overhead, but it's every 5 seconds, so it's not a big deal. And it is sending a request to that server to say, give me that information. And if you were to look in the logs of the server, you'd see that REST request coming in. You'd see it running, this request and happening every 5 seconds. And now if you did 2 different dashboards, you'd see twice as many requests. They might be coming in like every 2.5 seconds. If you timed it perfectly, right, there'd be one, and then 2.5 seconds another, and then 5 seconds another, and 7.5 another. Point is you'll be getting, instead of 12 per minute, you'll be getting 24 per minute. It's not that big a deal. So I hope that answers your question, Christopher. Okay, moving back. And wrapping things up, I know we're near the top of the hour. Some other notable aspects of the dashboard. The levels at which it considers warning you and when things are a problem, the yellow and red stuff, that's configurable as well. See the enterprise settings. I didn't go into it, but it was the next link down in the enterprise settings. And I'll just say that if you're getting frequent indications, remember we were looking at mine a moment ago and it kept turning orange saying long because there was one long running request. Long is defined in the dashboard as I think about 4 seconds. Maybe you might go, hey, look, I don't care that there's an occasional single request that takes 4 seconds. Or you might go, oh, that's very important. I need it to be when it's 2 seconds. All that's configurable. And that's in the enterprise settings. And the notification indicator, we talked about that already, and there's a whole discussion of notifications. There's a link about that. And one other little trick, I mentioned this in passing, that when you configure the dashboard, you put in the password for the instance. If someday you can't remember the password to get into a given FusionReactor instance, just go to the dashboard. If it's in the dashboard and you click on the link in the dashboard, it will open it and will log in automatically because you already stored that information in the dashboard. So that's a little trick. And by the way, keep that in mind that if you ever change the password in the instance, of course, you'll have to go back and change the password in the dashboard or it won't be able to talk to it. But you'll see that. It'll tell you, hey, I can't connect. And it'll tell you it's because of authentication problems. Okay. And then grouping instances, just real quickly, you saw that I had groups. They can be grouped any way you choose. They can be grouped by location, by apps they're running, by versions of the underlying app server they're running. An instance can be put into one or more groups, so you can make it be whatever you want to your heart's content. And the color coding effects, reflects all the instances. And it's just another powerful way for the dashboard to watch many instances at once, particularly helpful in an enterprise, network operations center, to watch in a dashboard kind of configuration on a bunch of monitors. So there's a whole discussion of managed groups in the documentation. Finally, there are mobile apps for FusionReactor, and these mobile apps just connect to the dashboard. That's what they do. So to use the mobile apps, you need the dashboard, and as long as the dashboard can be reached from the device and you provide the password, you'd get into that dashboard. And then they present the dashboard and options to drill down. They even present a subset of what would be in FusionReactor itself. So they're pretty interesting, the mobile apps. If you're interested in that sort of thing, just go, again, just Google FusionReactor Mobile, but there's the link to it, and there's documentation in the docs as well. There's also an Air Enterprise dashboard that was more interesting a few years ago, several years ago, when Air, Adobe Integrated Runtime, came out. It's interesting. It's a desktop app, and it can optionally pop up on alert, so that might intrigue you, and it's still available, and you can just Google FusionReactor Air Dashboard to learn more about that. It's free. As long as you have, these tools are all free, the mobile apps and the Air app, you just need to have a dashboard. So as long as you have Enterprise or Ultimate, Trial or developer, you can try all those things out. And I've mentioned several of these resources. I just gathered them up for you, again, if you were to get this later. So grouping by settings, grouping by scripting, the mobile and Air app stuff. And then one other thing is there is a doc called Configuring FusionReactor Enterprise and High Availability Environments. So some of you will be intrigued to learn some of what's discussed in there. It's a little bit more than what I talked about. Nothing I needed to draw out in particular. So the dashboard lets you watch many instances from a single screen. You can assess the overall health, drill down to key metrics, and even go all the way into the full FusionReactor user interface. You can set up the dashboard in either your regular FusionReactor instances or a FRAM instance to watch FusionReactor on any machine. You can group them, and you can configure what to do on unresponsive servers and use these mobile and Air apps. So the whole point is if you have multiple instances of FusionReactor, the dashboard can let you and help you better monitor and manage them. And so we're right at the top of the hour. Sorry, I went a minute over. Just want to say there's right now no other particular webinars being planned, being offered yet, but they're being planned. And just keep an eye on the webinars page to learn more about that. And as always, I point out that you can learn more about FusionReactor at the website, which has downloads and videos and docs and all kinds of cool stuff. And if you have questions, there's sales@fusion-reactor.com and support@fusionreactor.com. So just whatever makes sense for you, reach out to them. There's even a phone number for sales-oriented questions. And we do welcome your feedback on these webinars, this one or others we've done, and also any you'd like to see that we haven't done before.